Welcome to the webinar, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessica. I'm from the National Right to Housing Network, and I will be your moderator today. Today should be a really great session, and we're all so excited that you're able to join us today. Just before we get started, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the ancestral territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We recognize the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization and are committed to the ongoing decolonization of our systems and practices, guided in our work by the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the TRC Calls to Action, the MMIWG Calls to Justice, and the Principles of Indigenous Self-Determination. I myself am speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people on land also known as Ottawa. And just checking to see if Marie is in the call. Marie, if you happen to be in the call, I would like to invite you up so you could make your introduction. If she's not here, I can come back to her. Okay, it doesn't look like she's here. Just fine. Okay, so if you joined a little bit late, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We'd really like to know who's all here, and so we can get to know each other. Some quick housekeeping just before we get started here. Our session today is recorded. We are committed to making this space safe and accessible for everyone, so please read through our housekeeping items, which promise will put into the chat. And of course, please let us know if you need any help at any point during the webinar. The chat is open. We have some folks monitoring the chat, so please feel free to message us there. So today's webinar is in collaboration between the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, the National Indigenous Housing Network, and the National Right to Housing Network. We will hear from members of each of these organizations today as part of our panel. And just to quickly introduce each organization so you can get to know the panelists a little bit better. The Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network is focused on preventing and ending homelessness for women and gender diverse people across the country and advancing the right to housing for all. The National Indigenous Housing Network is a movement of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples who are dedicated to improving the living situations of Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse persons across Turtle Island. And the National Right to Housing Network is a network of leaders, organizations, and lived experience experts dedicated to the progressive realization of the right to housing in Canada and its meaningful implementation. We also have a member on our panel today from the Community Legal Assistance Society, which is a nationally recognized nonprofit law firm based in BC, which specializes in housing, income security, workers' rights, mental health, and human rights law. In today's webinar, we will share findings from our research project, which was generously funded by the BC Law Foundation, where we focused on gendered evictions in financialized housing markets across Canada. And we will also be highlighting our findings from the report and our submission to the National Housing Council's review panel on financialization. So just double checking to see if Marie is here before I pass it on to our first panelist.
I don't believe she's able to join. She's going to join as soon as she can though, Jess.
Okay, great. I'll keep an eye out for her. In the meantime, we could get started. I'll actually invite you, Caitlin, to come up to give your presentation.
Great. Thanks so much. Promise, are you able to share my slideshow?
Yes, just a second.
No problem. We're so thrilled you're here. This is like a very exciting topic that we've been thinking through at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network for ages, and just really thrilled to be having this conversation with all of you. My name's Caitlin Schwan. I lead the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. My pronouns are she, her, and calling in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I'll head over to the agenda slides. Thanks, Promise. We have a lot, we're ambitious with this webinar. We're going to try to cover a lot. We're going to give you some context on financialization and the right to housing, talk about some research that we've done on financialization, evictions, and gender. So that's really the focus for us today, is that intersection. Go over some recommendations, talk about what the National Housing Council is doing with respect to this topic. And there's an opportunity for you folks to be involved in the review panel. We're going to hear from our friends at the Community Legal Assistance Society in BC and talk about how to get involved from here. Great. Next slide. Thanks. So I thought it'd be helpful to kind of start off with a really brief framing on financialization. I suspect most folks in the room know what I'm talking about, but broadly what we're talking about when we say financialization of housing is we're talking about that shift from positioning housing as a social good, as a home, as a human right, to a commodity and towards an asset, a tool for accumulating wealth. So what happens in financialized housing markets, as many of you know, is the value of housing is really divorced from the foundational role that it plays in our human relationships, in our relationships with land and animals. I know my colleague Maureen McGregor-Pitawanakwat, she's struggling to join, but she will speak to this really beautifully. So when I think about financialization, yes, we're talking about policies and practices and taxation policies, but we're also talking about kind of a reorientation and ideological shift in how we've been thinking about housing. So a good example is just yesterday, I saw a bus that on the side said, money doesn't grow on trees, but it does grow in your home. And if you start to look for that kind of verbiage, you'll see it everywhere. This is kind of like the water we're swimming in right now when it comes to housing. So it's really important for us to be having these kind of conversations where we're thinking critically and about the ideology around financialization as well as policies and practices. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we certainly know is that financialization doesn't impact all groups equitably in Canada. At the Women's Network, where we've been looking and seeking to do some research, is the way in which gender impacts how women and gender diverse folks are experiencing financialized housing markets. So we submitted just recently a human rights claim to the Federal Housing Advocate, and financialization was one of kind of the three key pillars of human rights violations that we articulated. And so what you see here is an excerpt just on the screen here from that claim, where we're trying to articulate that the intersection between the feminization of poverty and gender-based violence has really severe consequences in financialized housing markets for women and gender diverse folks. Next slide, please. And you know, as all of you will know, the financialization has huge impacts in all dimensions of the right to housing, all of the 7 dimensions that we articulate in international human rights law. And I know my colleague Alex will speak to some of this. But what's important here is that we're in this really critical moment in Canada where we've adopted housing as a human right under the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019. It's on the left there. So we're trying to figure out what are the human rights duties of governments with respect to financialization. And what's important is governments have an immediate obligation to ensure that the right to housing applies to all people, irregardless of gender or other identities, and to be progressively moving towards realizing that right. And so we're looking at that intersection between financialization, gender, non-discrimination. Those are the pieces that are really important to the work we do. And we're going to speak more about this, but the National Housing Council is currently doing a human rights inquiry and review on financialization, on the financialization of purpose-built rental housing specifically. And there's also a House of Commons committee looking at this topic as well. So all of you are joining at a great time, a very timely time, and we're going to talk about how to get involved with those pieces. Next slide, please. So in the midst of all this, Women's Network, National Right to Housing Network came together, wanted to look at this intersection. We had really generous funding from the Law Foundation of BC to undertake this work and look at these questions that you see on the left hand there. So how do marginalized women and gender diverse folks experience eviction in financialized housing markets? How is gender impacting access to housing in these kind of markets? And then also, what are the human rights violations that these populations are experiencing? And we did kind of a pretty robust literature review, a review of best practices, human rights analysis, and engaged with stakeholders across the country on our analysis and our work. So I'm going to present kind of a few of our top findings in this regard, and then we'll hear from our other colleagues. Next slide, please. So I'll have Khulud, if you wouldn't mind dropping a link to the report in the chat for us here. The output from our research was this report, this quite a robust report, and we've made a submission to the National Housing Council's review panel and also to HUMA, the House of Commons committee that's looking at this. So I'd encourage you to read the full report. I'm doing like a very brief, like, here are 3 things that we thought were important, just to kind of whet our appetite for this. Next slide, please. So first issue that was really clear to us in our research is that the financialization of housing really exacerbates the conditions under which gender-based violence occurs. And so we're seeing these cycles of marginalization, eviction, and violence for women and gender diverse folks across the country. And part of the reason that we're seeing this happen is because of gendered security of tenure issues. So really specific ways in which women and gender diverse folks are able and unable to have security of tenure in their housing. Next slide, please. What we found, and some of you may be familiar with this research we did, is that security of tenure is very dependent on relationships for women and gender diverse folks across the country. So we did this very large survey about 1.5 years ago, and we asked, it was the largest survey on homelessness amongst women, gender diverse folks across the country. We asked, how did you lose your most recent housing? And you see a graph here, there's many, many variables. Folks could identify as many as they'd like. And the top reason that women and gender diverse folks said they lost their housing is because of a breakup, because a relationship fell apart. And so this outpaced all other kinds of issues, affordability, eviction, health crises. So what this really means, and what we saw in other parts of our research, is that many women and gender diverse folks have to remain in a romantic or sexual relationship of some kind, even if it's abusive, in order to remain housed. And that the experience of security of tenure is really dependent on that other person. The flip side of this is that we're seeing just a wave of informal evictions happening across the country for women and gender diverse folks, because they're not necessarily on the lease, and these breakups are actually the splitting point and pathway into homelessness. And in a financialized housing market, what we're seeing is that more and more women and gender diverse folks are being forced to remain in abusive relationships because they can't afford housing if they leave. So there's been some amazing research done in this area showing that the biggest challenge survivors of intimate partner violence have with respect to housing is financial. And it's actually often the survivor of violence that the landlord pursues for overdue rent, for damages, for kind of a range of financial issues. And Women Act, I know we have a colleague from Women Act here, did this great study and found that if women and gender diverse people experiencing violence do leave their home, they struggle to afford their housing for five years on average. So the trajectory is enormously huge. Next slide, please. What we also saw is that when we look specifically at gender diverse folks, trans folks, the statistics are quite similar. Their gender diverse trans folks are experiencing huge challenges with respect to their housing for all of the reasons that we know, including profound harassment and discrimination. But this is a group that is losing their housing through informal evictions. And if they do, they're in a much worse position in financialized housing markets as well. Next slide, please. What's important is we have to kind of understand these as human rights issues. We have the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing here, really articulating that in situations of household violence, legislation should ensure that regardless of whether a woman or someone who's gender diverse has title, formal ownership, or tenancy rights, that she or they is able to remain in their home and have the perpetrator removed. And I know there's folks in the room today who've done work on Safe at Home, and hopefully we'll get into a discussion on that. But it's really critical that we understand this as a key human rights principle and foundational to the right to housing for this population. Next slide, please. So central to the right to housing, again, is access to justice. When people experience violations of their rights, they need to have access to effective remedies. They have to have somewhere to go to claim the right. And what we found in our research is that access to legal remedies are particularly limited for women and gender diverse folks, especially multiply marginalized groups. And also that we have a range of eviction prevention programs across the country, but in large part, they're not targeted with a gender sensitive approach or an intersectional GBA plus approach. So to kind of get into a bit of the stats here, next slide, please, promise. Perfect, thank you. What we found, again, with our Pan-Canadian survey is that almost a third of women and gender diverse folks experiencing homelessness were unable to access legal help when they needed it. This was really high for young women and gender diverse people, which is really critically important because they're facing a huge range of intersecting legal injustice issues. And what we saw in our survey as well is that many women and gender diverse folks become homeless as children. So in this and as youth. So this lack of access to legal supports, advice is really happening kind of throughout the life course. Next slide, please. And it's important to kind of compare this to experiences of right to housing violations that are happening as well. So we know through the survey that 80% of women and gender diverse folks are experiencing at least one form of discrimination or have experienced at least one form of discrimination from a landlord and property manager. And for 16%, that's actually their pathway into homelessness. So these are really significant human rights issues, but really low access to legal supports. And I know we're going to hear about Danielle and the work that those folks are doing in BC with regards to this. That's so important. Next slide, please. And I suspect many folks on the call have a strong sense of what the severe consequences are of this, of failing to provide legal supports, of being unable to get legal supports when you're facing an eviction or you're experiencing an informal eviction. But just some of the quotes you see here are just incredibly frustrating and egregious examples of human rights violations. So, for example, there's a quote here about kind of a technical glitch that resulted in the eviction of a woman and her children. We're seeing women and gender diverse folks being evicted because they went to the hospital and they're on life support, and in the meantime they were evicted. Folks giving birth and experiencing complications, leaving the hospital and realizing they're evicted. So there's a huge wave of evictions that are happening, including at the intersection of kind of the technical piece as well. I think there's some folks from ACTO here too. ACTO's done some great work on the consequences of online hearings for landlord-tenant boards as well. Next slide, please. And so last but not least, I'm going to pass this on shortly, but I really wanted to emphasize a huge human rights issue is the lack of data on evictions across Canada. So it's entirely critical if we're imagining the progressive realization of the right to housing for us to actually know exactly what is going on. And so months ago, when we started this project, we thought, oh, we planned this webinar. It's going to be great. We're going to be able to create a really robust statistical picture of what's happening for women and gender diverse folks. We can't. The data is not, there are huge gaps in the data. And so I want to kind of review some of those gaps. So next slide, please, would be great. Thanks, Promise. Oh, yes. So again, the progressive realization of the right to housing really depends on governments having targets, timelines, goals, and associated resources to meet those goals. But we can't change what we're not measuring. And we have such severe gaps in data. And these gaps are really concerning in financialized housing markets, where we are losing affordable housing in ways and at speeds that we are having a really difficult time tracking. Next slide, please. So, when we imagined doing this webinar, we thought we'd have a great statistical portrait for all of you, but here are some of the gaps in the data that we found when we did this research. We found there's very limited disaggregated data around evictions with respect to gender, family composition, and other intersectional identities. Really difficult to track tenant wins and losses in landlord-tenant board tribunals and proceedings in most provinces and territories. We have huge gaps in longitudinal and kind of ongoing monitoring mechanisms. And at the same time, we're seeing rent evictions and dem evictions occurring, but not having many of the tools to actually track that. And lastly, we're seeing the kind of informal and illegal evictions that I'm talking about that are highly gendered. And if we go to the next slide, please, Promise. Thank you. We also know that homelessness for women and gender diverse folks is much more likely to occur in hidden forms. So all of you, I suspect, will know this. In the center, we have someone experiencing visible homelessness, but kind of around the outskirts of this infographic, we have the kind of homelessness that women and gender diverse folks are often experiencing, often in chronic forms. And so we have a huge population that is experiencing informal evictions, doesn't have access to justice. So this is a huge challenge that we're facing. And, as we move over to Marie, I a couple of questions that I would pose to the group is, how are we going to better collect data on evictions in general, but certainly informal evictions that we know are occurring because of breakups for women and gender diverse folks? And then how are we going to develop targeted eviction prevention programs for women and gender diverse folks across the country? So I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much. I believe Marie is here now, and I'll turn it over to her. Oh, perhaps Marie isn't here. Oh, there is Marie. Great.
Ani, bonjour, Wachier. Just testing. Can everyone hear? Please nod if you can. No? Yes. Okay. Mani McGregor, Pete Rockwood, Vision Plus, Do Dao, Do Winning, Don Jaba, Nungo, Lee Quentin, Manadon Manasin. My name is Marie McGregor, Pitawanakwat. I'm from South Bay, Doganing. I'm a South Bay woman, Where from Wequampong, unceded territory, Manitoulin Island, Northeastern Ontario. Welcome everyone to this session, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I serve as a co-chair of the National Indigenous Housing Network and also a co-chair of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and have been asked to participate in a discussion on the financialization of housing in Canada. I cannot participate without answering the question, how did this come to be? And because I bring to it, I'm wearing my Indigenous hat, and I'm looking at it with Indigenous eyes. I have to give you two dates. One is 2023 today, and the other is 35,000 to 50,000 years BP, before present. And those dates are important because they connect the situation that we're in now and also the beginnings of who we are as Indigenous peoples. One of the other favorite expressions that's used is since time immemorial. And I bring these up because the roots of financialization of housing goes back not just to when settlers arrived, but goes back to before that. And I'll walk you through some of those important dates and where some of the missteps have taken place. One of the first dates that I want to fly by you is 1763, which is when the Royal Proclamation was declared. And this is where the decision was made that any lands held by Indian people could not be sold to individuals or speculators or any companies. They had to be sold directly to a government. And that was a government to government decision. The other word I want to use today is treaties. And these are important because they still exist. And these are important because if in order to untangle the financialization of housing in Canada, the players have to look to the treaty holders. And the treaty holders are those Indians, and I have to say Indians because that's what we were known as at the time, were and are sovereign nations. Treaties can only be made between sovereign nations. And at the time that the treaties were made, we were and are sovereign nations. And so that's why you have a nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada and the government of Canada. If the terms of the treaties are not enforced, the treaties become null and void. If the treaties become null and void, we take back 100% of those lands. Let's talk about those lands for a moment. How much is there? 9,985,000 kilometers from coast to coast to coast. It's the second largest landmass in the world. And my question is, how is it possible, given such a vast landmass with such a richness of resources, that even one person is homeless or inadequately housed in such a rich country? That's my question. I also want to walk you through some other dates and how they connect to the financialization of housing. So 1763 was one. Let me take you back to 1670. There was a character named Prince Rupert, and he was exploring in North America, in particular the Hudson Bay lowlands, and he liked what he saw and he wanted it. So he went home to his cousin, the king, and he asked him, "King, can I have these lands?" And King says to Prince Rupert, "Sure you can. Here, I'll sign them over to you right now. There you go." And that's how Prince Rupert's lands came to be. Those lands, by the way, consisted of all of the Hudson Bay lowlands and eventually included what are now parts of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and eventually reached all the way to the Pacific coast. The problem with that is no one asked the people that lived there at the time if it was okay to be explored, if it was okay to have the lands taken away, and did anyone ask the people who lived there for permission? Were the lands purchased? And if they were, where is the purchase receipt? That is one of the underpinnings of your situation of financialization of housing in Canada now. So we have 1670. Let's go forward a bit to 1792, where property law, coming from statute and common law, which is English law, by the way, was established in what's now Ontario, then called Upper Canada, in 1792. English law established the property law, common law, and statute law in British Columbia in 1858. And that same English law established statute law and common law for property in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta in 1870. Now, these dates are important. And let me give you an example. The first real estate board was formed in Vancouver in 1888, fully 30 years after English law established through common law and statute law that property could be transacted. And I want to go then to 1867, where the Constitution Act, or the British North America Act. And this is where the division of federal and provincial powers came to be. And this is where responsibility for Indians and lands reserved for Indians came into effect. And that was attributed to the federal government. And that's why there is federal legislation providing for Indians and lands reserved for Indians. That still exists now. That's where that division of powers came into being. And at the same time, the province then had powers over property, real property. And that's how that came to be. So then let's go back to 1888 in Vancouver. So the real estate board was formed. So my question is, how were those lands obtained? From whom? Through treaty, through expropriation, or through theft? Those answers need to be made clear. And theoretically, to establish ownership of lands, an individual should be able to trace title to the original grant of land from the Crown, Crown with a capital C. But let me ask this question. How did the Crown get a hold of Indigenous lands? That needs to be answered as well. And that filters right back through the discussion about financialization of housing. And the reason it's important is because 11% of Canada's land is privately owned. That means 1,098,350 square kilometers of land, okay? So that's quite a chunk of land, and if you can imagine, quite a monetary value attached to such a sizable property. So my question then becomes, what authority or instrument provided for real estate transactions in Canada before 1867 and after 1867? I want to know what the authority is or what the instrument is that provided for that. Who had the authority to provide that? And to whom was it provided? And were Indigenous peoples included in those discussions anywhere? Let's talk about Indigenous peoples for a moment. There are now nearly 2 million Indigenous people in Canada, including the Inuit, status, non-status, and Métis. Canada's population is approximately 38 million people. And if you look at the demographics, that majority population of non-Indigenous peoples is aging. They're in the baby boomer stage and they're preparing for retirement and for aging in retirement homes. In contrast, we have nearly 2 million Indigenous people, a majority of whom are under 20 and are just entering their post-secondary phases and also their learning to make a living phase. So the bulk of that population is in that age bracket. So there are going to be many Indigenous people coming of age who will need housing, whether it's rental housing or housing ownership. Speaking of Indigenous people, 13.5% of Indigenous peoples live in unaffordable or inadequate housing. And if you go back to Indian reserves, the amount of that land is a mere 1/3 of 1% of the total land mass of Canada. And we're trying to squeeze 2 million people into 1/3 of 1% of Canada's land mass. Not possible, since about 60% of status Indians live off reserve in other places, whether rural, urban, northern, and living in different types of housing all across the country. And also, given the fact that many Indigenous peoples have not been able to complete a secondary education, never mind the post-secondary. And also that some of the income generating activities are denied to them through various mechanisms, through racism, through discrimination, through Indigenous peoples not being able to jump through the hoops, if you know what I mean. So those are the kind of challenges that are in front of us. I also wanted to talk about We are in a neoliberal capitalist society, and in looking at how financialization came to be, I think Canada was trying to prevent the tragedy that took place in the United States in 2008 when their bubble burst, subprime mortgage problem. And here what happened was the CMHC provided a buffer to those who wanted to acquire housing. And that spurred the acquisition of housing, not for housing to live in, but for housing to serve as an asset or a wealth generating mechanism. And in our traditional teaching, a home is not an asset. A home is not a wealth generating mechanism. A home is a home is a home. It is a place to rear your children, take care of your elders, take care of generations of family members if necessary, to be part of the community, to be able to access resources and harvest those resources, to farm, to trap, to hunt, to gather, to take care of our medicines. That was the purpose of a home. A home in our teachings was never intended as a place to use it to make money. And the fact that that's what's happening now is a tragedy, not just for Indigenous people, but for all people, and particularly those who are in low income, as for seniors, for those who are disabled, for Indigenous women who go missing, murdered, and are abused through domestic violence, through gender-based violence. And the reason that there was murdered and missing Indigenous women's final report was because the numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women reached such proportions that it came to the notice of the whole country. And the recommendations that are in that report need to be acted on so that housing and homes are provided for our most vulnerable, including gender diverse. And I also wanted to make reference to the homeless. There was a chart in one of the documents that showed at one extreme homelessness, and then shelter housing, and then transitional housing, and then rental housing, and then market ownership of housing. And those stages of different types of housing, it's useful to understand that. But again, from an Indigenous point of view, it's not a continuum where you start off with being homeless with the ultimate goal of going to ownership of an asset. The responsibility for us is minnow-the-modswin. Our responsibility is to live well. And whatever living well means is our task in life to learn what that is. If it means to provide a home for our children and our elders and other people in our family, in our clan, then that's what we need to do. If minnow-the-modswin means looking after the land and its resources, the animals, the birds, and the fish, then that's what we need to do. If minnow-the-modswin means calling out the errors in the financialization of housing, then that's what we need to do. On the one hand, it solved the problem by not putting Canadian homeowners in the same precarious situation as it did very many American homeowners at the time. But at the same time, it left out vulnerable people, seniors, Indigenous, disabled, gender diverse, and those that are not able to provide housing for themselves. And in this country, the purpose of minnow-the-modswin is to look out for other people. And that's the teaching that I bring to you today. And I ask you to do whatever you need to do with minnow-the-modswin in order to help other people live well, and including to help yourself live well. And that's my thought for you today. And on that note, I'll stop. Jimmy Wetch.
Thank you so much, Marie. That was so insightful and helpful for everyone. If folks have questions for Marie or Caitlin or any of the panelists today, we do have a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to ask their questions then. Some of my colleagues are also dropping links and other useful resources in the chat. So, all right. I'll turn the mic now over to my colleague, Alex from the National Right to Housing Network.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today, and also thank you, Caitlin and Marie, for giving really important context. I know I'm going to be reflecting on your words as we move forward in today's session. As Jessica said, my name is Alex Nelson. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am the Community Engagement and Research Specialist for the National Right to Housing Network. I'm joining today from lands connected to Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chinantan nations, colonially known as London, Ontario. Today, I'm going to be speaking a little bit more about the right to housing specifically. Caitlin and Marie both spoke about the right to housing and provided really important background and context. But today we're talking about using and leveraging tools that are available to us under the 2019 National Housing Strategy Act. Could I get you to switch the slide, please? Thank you. And so I want you to get a little bit of a picture of where our recommendations from the report that Caitlin was talking about are going. This is the context for demanding action around the recommendations for this report. And at the end, I will come back to those recommendations. When we're talking about the right to housing, we're talking about so much more than just 4 walls and a roof. We're actually talking about access to justice. But what does that look like in action? Next slide, please. Under the National Housing Strategy Act, which was passed in 2019, Canada has adopted and committed to 3 mechanisms that actually come from international human rights frameworks. The first is the Federal Housing Advocate, who is an independent advocate housed at the Canadian Human Rights Commission. She actively engages with rights holders, experts, and research into systemic issues, like the experiences of homelessness of women and gender diverse people that we're talking about today. And importantly, the Federal Housing Advocate receives submissions on systemic issues, conducts their own reviews, and then refers certain issues to a review panel. The second mechanism is the National Housing Council, which advises the Minister of Housing to ensure that the National Housing Strategy furthers the progressive realization of the right to housing. They also appoint 3-person review panels to hold hearings on systemic issues. And then finally, review panels themselves, which are comprised of 3 members of the National Housing Council, prioritizing lived experience and human rights expertise. They hold hearings on systemic issues, receive testimony and evidence, and then submit their findings and recommendations to the Minister of Housing. And importantly, the minister must then respond to the findings and recommendations of the review panel within 120 days. But where are we at in this process? The first review panel on the financialization of purpose-built rental housing was announced in February, and the National Housing Council and review panel is receiving submissions until August 31st. The report and work that we're discussing today is our joint submission to this review panel on financialization. I'll return to this in a moment when I share some of our recommendations, but the advocate has also requested a second review into the failure to eliminate homelessness amongst women and gender diverse people. This second review is the culmination of 2+ years of community advocacy, research, and the hard work of advocates and lived experts from the National Indigenous Housing Network and the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. So you can see pictured on the screen here, the front covers of 2 human rights claims that were submitted to the Federal Housing Advocate in review in June 2022. But to backtrack a little bit, this team of advocates and external human rights experts came together to create these 2 really robust systemic claims to the Federal Housing Advocate on gendered experiences and the experiences of Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people. These claims really are the product of significant care and collective advocacy to outline what we are seeing in our communities and what our demands are for an alternate future of housing and homelessness for women and gender diverse people. Next slide, please. So we were able to formally launch these claims in Ottawa last June. These are just some photos from the launch, which was this really exciting moment where we were able to come together and speak to the process of building these beautiful and important claims. Next slide, please. And then as a following step, we were able to hold an in-person gathering in Toronto in late 2022 of rights claimants, researchers, and community and international human rights experts. Many of the folks are actually on the call today, so it's nice to see you again. And as others can attest, this was such a powerful space where people provided testimony of their experiences to support the claim and to demand accountability and action. And after this outpouring of experience, next slide, please. Experience, narrative, and demands for systemic change in the housing and homelessness system, the Federal Housing Advocate requested a review into the failure to eliminate homelessness amongst women and gender diverse people. This is really, really exciting, and we have a unique opportunity to shape what this looks like for our peers and communities to engage in. This process is unfolding, and my colleagues are going to talk a little bit more about how you can get involved in this work, but we need your support and expertise to make this panel and hearing come to fruition, incite action, and to ultimately achieve justice. But it's also really important that we make sure every review panel has an intersectional focus and adopts a gendered lens, including especially the current review on financialization. This is the full context within which we are presenting our work on financialization and gendered experiences of evictions today. So I'm going to circle back now to our submission to the Financialization Review Panel to leave you all with a selection of some of our key recommendations from our submission to the active hearing. Next slide, please. My colleagues are going to link to our report so you can read the full list of recommendations. We have a few versions with more robust lists of recommendations, but here is just a selection of some of these recommendations for consideration. So employ an intersectional and human rights-based understanding of security of tenure when addressing financialization and its role in evictions across the country. Importantly, meaningfully engage lived experts in all stages of decision-making on evictions policies, practices, and protocols for systemic reform. Expand and explore gender-sensitive approaches to eviction prevention, because the unique landscape of women and gender-diverse people's experiences, we face compounding and invisibilized issues relating to informal evictions and a lack of security of tenure. Address gaps in data on evictions, particularly focusing on gender disaggregated and intersectional data. And review and revise the National Housing Strategy to include stronger and clearer gender-based targets. Next slide, please. And then ensure that government-funded projects do not result in dem-evictions or rent-evictions of existing tenants. Conduct a review on provincial eviction laws and develop national standards around security of tenure. And then finally, invest in alternative housing models to counter financialization, focusing on sustainable and local housing solutions that generate community governance and wealth, particularly for Black and Indigenous communities. So these, as I mentioned, are just a few of the recommendations that we've created with our report and submission to the review panel. But to get a better sense of what this kind of justice process can look like in action in specific communities, I'm going to pass the floor to my colleague Danielle to talk a little bit more about the landscape of financialization in BC. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alex. Happy to be here. Great to see you all and be a part of this. I'm learning so much and just so grateful to be in this space with you all. My name is Danielle. I am speaking to you from the unceded and stolen territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. colonially known as Vancouver. So I work for an organization in BC called the Community Legal Assistance Society, and it's a big organization that does a lot of legal work, but I'm in a program called the Community Law Program, where our focus is providing service work as well as engaging in systemic law reform in various areas of law. Most of those areas intersect, including income security, housing, workers' rights, human rights, mental health. My focus tends to be on housing, but of course, all of those intersecting areas often are part of the larger work that we do. In terms of our service work, and in particularly our service work on housing, we tend to focus and prioritize helping folks who are facing eviction at the point where they've already been given an eviction notice, have disputed that notice, and have not been successful at what we call the Residential Tenancy Board here in Vancouver. I know other provinces and territories have different names, but here in BC, we refer to it as the Residential Tenancy Board, or the RTB. So once a tenant receives a decision, and if that's a negative decision, then we help them with those next steps. And what those next steps can look like are an internal review at the RTB or a judicial review at the BC Supreme Court. But at that point, you're already very limited in the grounds for appeal and what that decision can be challenged, because oftentimes the law dictates what a decision maker or an arbitrator can and cannot do and how to apply the law. So at that point, that's already been decided, and there's not too much intervention by the courts to question that decision by the arbitrator, especially if they've applied the law correctly. So the main issue that we're encountering when we're assisting folks who have been evicted and want to challenge that decision is the law itself, that oftentimes enables the arbitrator to make that very unjust, very unfair decision for that particular tenant. And so what we find in the work that we do, and tying this to financialization, is there is an economic incentive here in BC, a big one, to evict tenants. And that's why we see a lot of evictions. A lot of evictions oftentimes are completely baseless, and then really bad decisions that sort of stem from that real inadequate law. And ironically, the purpose of the Residential Tenancy Act, which governs residential tenancies in BC, is supposed to protect tenants. But how can you protect tenants when the entire basis of housing is completely founded on financialization? You're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to do that unless there is that recognition and that implementation into provincial law and laws in various provinces and territories to commit to recognizing housing as a human right. Because until that happens, financialization is going to be the driving force behind a lot of evictions. And as we've learned today, disproportionately impacts women and gender diverse people, as well as Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So we're often really in this position where, we're having to help a tenant at the point where they've already been evicted because of a very inadequate law that does not serve to protect their security of tenure. And the government's response to housing issues tends to often be to either create something that will deter that behavior, or something that may, in fact, compensate a tenant after they've been evicted, but not a lot in there about preventing that eviction. And I want to highlight two specific examples of that do impact women and gender diverse people quite a bit. And that is, the fact that our government has recognized and understands household and family violence. And as a result, there has been, it's a more recent inclusion into our Residential Tenancy Act, a provision in the act that allows for someone who is experiencing household violence or family violence to leave the household without facing any penalty. Typically, if a tenant doesn't give proper notice, they can face a penalty if the landlord then has a loss of rental income. So this new provision recognizes that sometimes people have to leave immediately without giving that notice if they're experiencing household or family violence. So this provision, very welcomed. It's necessary. Of course, there are flaws with how it's set up and timing and whatnot, but the fact that government has recognized that was a very good first step. And I say first step because there's so much more that needs to be done. Because again, the focus tends to be on how do we help people who've already left? How do we deter certain behaviors? But there's not a lot of focus on how do we ensure folks are kept in their homes. Gender-based violence or household violence or family-based violence can be a reason why a tenant is evicted. It can be a reason why a tenant is evicted because a landlord can evict a tenant if they unreasonably disturb or basically cause some sort of disturbance to another tenant in the building. So if that violence spills over and has that effect, that tenant can be evicted, and often it is the person who's experiencing the violence that is evicted. Also, here in BC, a person can be evicted by the actions of their guest, and it's not uncommon to have a client who is a woman or a gender diverse person whose partner attends their home, has either caused some sort of disturbance with the other tenant or has caused some property damage, and it's the person who's brought in that guest that then gets evicted because a tenant is tied to their guest and is seen as responsible for their guest's actions. So we've seen this happen where people bring in those guests are disruptive, but any attempt on their part to prevent that from happening could just result in them being in a further unsafe situation, or they're very limited in what they can do. And rather than recognize that and rather than accommodate that, ensure the safety of that person, the response and what the law allows for is to evict that person. And that's where we're seeing women and gender diverse people entering into these second stage housing or these temporary models of housing, which I'll go really quickly over, is sort of the second thing I wanted to mention too. And it's part of the work that we're doing is recognition that in second stage housing, like transitional housing, or even an emergency shelter, folks should still have rights in those living spaces. And here in BC, if someone's in transitional housing, the Residential Act doesn't apply. So there are no rights or protections. A person could be evicted without notice. They could be treated very poorly. We actually often hear about carceral conditions experienced by people who are in these temporary homes when having to, flee from a crisis or stabilize. And oftentimes there are zero rights. So what we're seeing there too is a lot of inadequate housing, people not feeling safe, people feeling like they're now having to leave their home and enter into something that is not really a home, it's inadequate, and there are no protections for them. So another piece of our work is working towards recognizing that folks who live in transitional housing or emergency shelter should also be provided with rights in those spaces as well, because sometimes those living spaces that are meant to be temporary aren't temporary and they're long-term. And so we in the work that we do recognize that it's important that even though the model that we have is not adequate to protect tenants and there's still a long way to go there, some protection with what we already have, which is the Residential Tenancy Act here in BC, is necessary in all these types of housing, even those temporary spaces. So I just want to be mindful of the time, so I'll end it there and I will turn it over to Caitlin and Alex. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Just be mindful of the time. I know some folks may have to head out. So how about we actually go straight into Q&A? We'll stay for another 15 or so minutes in case folks want to ask some questions. And for those who have to leave, we are going to have a recording of this webinar, which we will send over to everyone in a follow-up email. So if you have to leave, that's okay. But for those who want to stay, that's great as well. You can use the raise hand function, or you can type the question in the chat and we'll have members of our team ask the questions on your behalf.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, we're just getting the tech set up here. I also want to mention, so the financialization review that's being done by the National Housing Council, they've just extended their deadline. So the report that we're talking about today, we're submitting to the review panel, and would just encourage all of you folks to also create a submission. The deadline there is August 31st. So we actually have quite a bit of time. And they are very, very eager to hear, especially from folks with lived expertise and rights holders, but anyone who's doing work in the area of financialization, and especially with respect to purpose-built rental housing. That's going to be really critical. Thanks.
Thanks, Caitlin. I see Jules has her hand up. Jules, if you want to ask your question.
Sure, it's Jewel. Hey, I was trying not to be the first, but I was watching and nobody's putting their hand up. So I have a few points. Just so I'm Jewel Smith, and I am normally I'm on the unceded traditional territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, and I haven't yet memorized in Revelstoke. There's 5 different nations represented, and so I'm visiting this area. It was a gathering area, and it's quite a complex space to be in because there's a lot of history on the land here. I do want to, my area of expertise and research and interest and lived experience is women with disabilities, and particularly mothers with disabilities. And I do a lot of work around housing and women with disabilities fleeing violence and the experience. So I have a couple of points. I know that intimate partner violence is the preferred terminology, but I would encourage folks to consider including interpersonal violence as well, because it includes caregiver violence, which is something that women with disabilities and folks with disabilities in general experience in a way that able-bodied people generally don't understand or experience. And this can have a detrimental effect on where they're living, how they experience home and safety, and how they can or cannot access emergency shelter, because often caregivers can't follow folks into those spaces. I also just want to, as you would expect me to, Caitlin and friends, I just want to amplify that one of the most catastrophic ways that losing your housing when you're a disabled person is the accessibility of your home. And often when women and gender diverse folks have to flee their home, they lose that accessibility. And it's a really critical point that I'm asking colleagues and allies and people who want to learn more to just really dig your feet into and understand how profoundly it is. If you're parenting in an accessible home, you can parent just fine. When you move into a space that's inaccessible, you look like you're a bad parent, and then you lose custody of your children. And so the kind of dominoes effect of accessibility and violence and housing and financialization and being, you know, attached to a human who maybe is violent towards you, whether it's a partner or a caregiver. Pensions that are inadequate to pay for housing is a really important topic as well, because when you're on a government pension or even like a former job that gives you a pension because you've become disabled, often you can't afford adequate housing, you can't afford accessible housing, and you end up in these situations that were highlighted throughout this talk. And then my final point, I just want to point out, I did message her, but Megan at CCHR, I'm working on 2 projects with them, one looking at violence against women in housing and one looking at tenants with disabilities. But I know that they're doing a lot of work in collecting data, and I suggest reaching out to her, and I already initiated it, just to ask about, is the data they're collecting disaggregated that you could pull from? Because I know they're investing a lot of hours, and I'm always well aware that we we only have so many hours in the day, each of our organizations and our own individual selves. And so to work together to see where other folks are doing work that we can pull from, I think is really critical. Thank you.
I'll just quickly respond, Jewel. All of those points are so brilliant. You articulate all of them so well, and complicate our conversation today in ways that really need to be heard. So thank you so much. I also am thinking with respect to accessibility, like it's going to be really important and helpful for us to understand the effect that rapid financialization of housing has on accessibility, insofar as if the driving impetus with financialized housing is profit generation, to what extent does accessible housing support or prohibit the kind of profits that folks can make with single room bedrooms, for example, or condos? Or so if folks are working at the intersection around accessibility and financialization, I think data and research in that area is going to be really helpful, and helpful for the National Housing Council's review panel. So super grateful for your comments, Jewel.
Just one thing to add on that. One of the things you've probably heard me say, I've said over and over now for, I don't know, like 15 years, that when government gives money to projects, they should demand universal design construction. If it's a new build, it should never be built so that it's inaccessible and has to be completely reworked to be accessible. And I feel like if every single one of our voices just insistently said that, we might make headway, because any one of you, if you're able-bodied right now, if you live long enough, you're going to be disabled. Anything can happen and you become disabled. Somebody you love who wants to visit you might be disabled, or you might fall in love with somebody who's disabled. And so building every single new unit in accessible design is just critical. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jewel. Those are some very excellent points. Okay, I'll go to the next question. Hillary?
I live in my partner's house, and I had to have a ramp built because I'm disabled. So I use the ramp for my walker. I can get around the house okay without the walker, but when it comes to going outside, I need the walker and I can't get up the steps. So it's very important, these new builds, build a ramp, not a steep ramp. It's hard to get up on the back when you're pushing a walker or a wheelchair. So please, 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 please think about building a low ramp with a low angle. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Hillary. I'm not seeing any other hands. If you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or put your question in the chat and we can read that out. Give folks maybe a few more seconds in case. All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We have a lot of resources that was shared in the chat, so please take a look at that just before we leave here. And again, we are going to be sending the recording and all the follow-up resources in our email. And yeah, thank you so much. And we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.